Welcome to Pathinator Travel Lounge, exploring and helping our world and ourselves. I'm your host, Joseph Koch. This is our first podcast, and the way it's going to work then is we'll talk a little bit about, as you can tell, the podcast is about travel and help, so how are those two connected? Before we get into that, I'm going to back up, and we'll go through some background. So I've traveled to 150 plus countries. How did that start? We'll take it from the beginnings. So first off, I grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. I had 7 sisters, and so there's 10 in the family, so there's a lot going on with 10 people around. I would say we lived a fairly sheltered life, to be honest. We had, the basics and things like that, but we didn't go on many family trips. Our one really family vacation was to the Milwaukee Zoo. Milwaukee was about an hour away. But because we were living fairly basic lives and didn't have a lot of extras, I wasn't traveling at 10 years old. So I worked a lot on the farm with that work ethic. I think that was something that was very important, but also then because of my upbringing, we were a Catholic family. The idea of helping others was prevalent early in my life. So those are where the connections start. Even though we didn't travel a lot, we had, I guess, a lot of curiosity about travel, partly because I was a little bit sheltered maybe, and I was always interested I'd like to go there, or I'd like to go to this place and that place. And in the back of my mind, helping others was important. So it kind of started way back then. And I did go to college. I went to UW-Madison. I graduated from Madison and went for my master's degree. And I did go for education. And one of the things then that I was interested in, maybe it was for the Foster's beer commercials, I was always interested in Australia. I thought it was an interesting place. It seemed like a fun place to go to, interesting people and whatnot. And with student teaching then, I student taught. My first part of it was in Milwaukee, Washington Inner City School. And then there's an opportunity to work at a school in a different country. And obviously it was English-based, so there's some options: England, Ireland, New Zealand, and Australia. But Australia then, to me, as I stated, was something that I was always interested in. So I ended up going to Australia to a little town called Dromana, which is down the beach from Melbourne. And I came with my big suitcase. It was the first time I really had traveled. We had gone to spring break in Mexico, but my first really truly international trip, I would say, was to Australia. And one of the things to note then is that they travel quite a bit, as opposed to the U.S. where, you start with 2 weeks as far as travel, possible days off. In Australia, a lot of times it's 6 weeks. Okay, so just by definition, there's more chance to travel. But I think it's also in a lot of Aussies' blood to be the travel bug. So I went there, again, with my big suitcase and stayed with my cooperating teacher. And one of the things they said was because, we have 2 weeks in between quarters, they said, as opposed to a long summer break. There's a summer break, but it's shorter, and then between the quarters, there's a 2-week break. So within the school year, there's a chance to head out for a couple weeks, and a lot of them do. Again, just because of I believe the Aussies' love of travel. So they got me going. Somebody set me up with a backpack and suggested a few different places in Australia. And that's the first time I really backpacked, and I stayed in some backpackers' hostels. And when I started to do that, I realized then that there's a lot of neat places to go. And I really did like my time in Australia, and I credit Australia with getting me going on traveling. It was the first really international place I went to, but it cultivated a love I had of travel after that. So I went back to the U.S. then. They actually offered me a job. Actually, on the way back, I had stopped at Fiji, 2-3 day layover both ways. At that time, it was just a trip, a flight in Saturday and Wednesdays. And I flew on, I believe, on a Saturday, and then, most people continued, but it was a free layover in Fiji, so I stayed in Fiji for 3 days. And on the flip side, on the way back, I stayed as well for the extended layover. And when I did that then, I stayed at Club Fiji, it was called, and there was a British woman, who was owning the bar, basically. And she said, she seemed like an older lady at that time. But now at my age, she doesn't seem like an older person, but she did at the time. So she was a little bit older than me. I talked to her on the way out to Australia, and then she said, stay on the way back. So I said, okay, I definitely will. When I came back, she said she met a man that was going to fly her around the world for a while and asked if I could look after Club Fiji for a few months or however long it took. She said she didn't really trust the people there with the finances, so she wanted me to take over. So I thought, well, I considered it, but my mindset was to go home at that time, so I went home. So I started to meet these kind of, I don't know what you call them, vagabonds, and I don't think she's a true vagabond. People that just jump around quite a bit. I was started to get interested in that lifestyle as well. People that jump around a place or two, go to a different country. But I did go back to the U.S., and I taught a little bit, but I didn't really find a job that I liked very much in education. I found a job, but not really one that I liked. And I got into IT as a computer programmer. And I had a couple of trips as a computer programmer. My first one overseas then was Kenya and Egypt. And that was interesting. It was a couple of weeks that I went back to the corporate world after that, after a couple of weeks. And also my first time in Europe, a lot of times, people go maybe London, Paris, Rome. I went Prague, Budapest, Vienna. Largely because I thought when I was younger, the Soviet bloc I could never go to. And the fact that I could now go to Eastern Europe was of interest to me, and I like those places. But then again, much like the Kenya-Egypt trip, I returned back to my job. Eventually then after Y2K, the jobs basically went away, and I got basically sick of doing it as well. So I decided to leave IT, and when I did, I traveled around the world for 6 months, and obviously then this is really what got me going. Australia started me going, but this is really what the trip around the world then has really got me interested in travel. So that was a 6-month trip. Went home for Christmas, and before the trip, there's so many things I was worried about. There's so many reasons not to do it. So obviously, financial is one reason. It's a big reason not to do a 6-month around the world trip. There's other things I was making up excuses. For instance, I never missed a Packer game in 30 years. Well, I'm going to miss a Packer game. Should I really go? I decided, well, yeah, I probably should go, even if I'm missing the Packers. And luckily, my parents taped those games for me, and I could watch them when I return. So all these excuses not to go, and I'm like, well, I want to do this. Let's do it. And then when I came back for Christmas, and decided a couple more months, and I went to Central America. At that point, obviously, I was starting to get low on money, and you have to face the responsibilities and not just escape. So I came back and got back into education, and obviously the advantage of teaching is the summer's off, as far as travel at least, is the summer's off. So I was able to do a lot of trips then in summers, and it was literally then last day of school. We always had a luncheon. Last day of school, just kind of looking at the clock. Once it's done, quick run to the airport, and I'd come back the day before in service. So I used up all those 10 weeks and 11 weeks. How did I do it? Well, first as a around the world trip, I just kind of plotted places I wanted to go, and then started to figure out, okay, I'm going to start here in England, I'm going to go to Russia, do a Eurail pass, move into Turkey, fly over to India, etc. That same thing happened in the monthly trip, the summer trips as well. Okay, I kind of wanted to go here, I kind of want to go here, go to a continent, and then narrow it down to a region and head out. And when I started to do that, this sounds weird, but there's travel skills. I was pretty green when I came. Again, I consider myself fairly sheltered. And so I was green, and I was trying to figure out how to travel. And the things that I learned about travel are the same things that made me successful travel, were the same things that made me successful in life, or any person in life. As far as backpacking then, I figured out how to when I traveled first time, it was way too much. The first time I traveled was actually with a suitcase, then a big, heavy backpack. Luckily, I got robbed, and I went with a smaller backpack and less clothes. I had way too many things. And what I started to do on subsequent trips is the 20% rule. In other words, if I didn't use it once every 5 days, I didn't pack it. Obviously, medications and stuff like that, daily medications I pack, but I'm talking about clothes and other things as well. It's amazing how little you do need. And I'd put it in my backpack and run up and down a block to make sure I could run with the backpack, walk around it might look weird to my neighbors, but walk around for about 15 minutes to make sure I could carry it and it wasn't too heavy. So that's part of it, but also how to carry yourself and how to interact with people. It didn't take long for me to figure out who to trust and who not to trust. And a lot of times the people that come up to you were people that I didn't trust. And there's a couple times I got robbed, and a couple times I got played for money and cash. And maybe then, you don't want to go over the board either and not trust anybody, because in the end you have to trust somebody when you travel, and not just travel, but also when you're going through life. And as I went through this, I got more and more comfortable traveling and carrying myself during these trips. And instead of looking for just a good time, people ask me, were they mission trips? I was on a mission, but it was looking for fun mission. It wasn't a religious mission trip. As I started doing more and more of it, though, and getting older, it went from having a good time and going out to looking more at these countries and what were happening in these different places, and looking at what was the good things happening and what were the bad things that were happening. And what you start to notice is you start to see some trends. There's definitely unique situations and unique places, but there's different trends as far as who's in control, how those people run the countries, different areas as far as why is one area successful, why is another area not successful. You start to see all these different things. So that's something that became more of interest to me. And then I noticed other people, I became more aware here in the U.S., but also overseas, of the groups then that were trying to help. And were they trying to help, or were they actually hurting? All of them were trying to help, I would assume, but were they actually hurting? I should take that back. There are probably some groups that are set up and deceiving people, but in general, I think most of the groups are trying to help, but were they helping or were they hurting? So what started to happen when I came back from these trips and taught, I became more and more of a legend for my stories with my students. So we talked about all these different things as far as these stories and not. And some people even thought, did you make that up? Is that really happening? Like, yeah, that actually did happen. And as more and more years passed, and more stories and more students and coworkers heard about this, some people started to say, well, why don't you take me with you? I'd like to, travel with you and stuff like that. And my idea is now, no, I ride solo. I'm just backpacking myself. But eventually one of the parents of one of the students came to me and said, listen, I lead trips to Belize. He worked at a community college. I've been to Belize 15 times, and I know my son wants to go on the trip, and he'll really organize it with his friends, and you and me can organize the travel arrangements. Why don't you lead a trip? And the more and more I thought about it, let's try it. We'll do it one time and see how it works. So that was the idea of Pathinator. So if you think of the Terminator and traveling your path, put that together. So Pathinator. So we led this trip to Belize then, and we've led several trips since. And that's part of the emphasis then of these trips. So we're looking at the country, and it's not, I don't call it like a death march. It's a fun time as well, but it's not spring break. So we looked at it from that angle. We want to see all the positives, but all the negatives of an area as well. And when we did that, we started to get, I would say, a more realistic look at what the country or the place that we were going to is like. And as we're doing that, the idea behind PTL, the trips through Pathinator, is that it's transparent. All the money, where the money's going, it's obvious to the travelers. And usually what we do is we put a pad in. In other words, if something bad would happen, and all of a sudden, and sometimes they have, and all of a sudden we need an extra $1,000, we use that pad up. Fortunately, most of the time something really, really bad hasn't happened, and we've always had money left then. That pad has stayed, or at least partially stayed. So at the end, what to do with the pad? Well, there's an option of taking it back, and so far, nobody's done that. Once they pay for it, they just expect it's paid for. 2, to give it to me as a tip, as leading the trip, and that's happened sometimes. But also then other times we decided then, let's give money to this person or this organization, and we have a discussion then of who's deserving, and that's an interesting part of it. So they don't have to decide as a group. You could do it individually, but a lot of times the group decides to give it to one person or 2 different people. And it might be something as simple as a person then that was just very kind to us at the restaurant. We've given other times to, in Haiti, somebody that was working to be a doctor. So that was helping her, but then by extension, we're paid for university. All the people that she would eventually help. It's what they found, to be the best. So that's what we started to do. But there's other times that when we examined it, and we're thinking, does this actually help or hurt the people there? And that's part of the discussion as well. Does tourism help or hurt? So as we moved along, we've developed that idea a little bit more and more. For instance, the well in Africa, this is a fairly typical one, a water well. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, to build a water well, but what happens, a lot of times it's for the person or the organization's marketing. Look, we built a well in Africa. What happens in a couple of years when that well starts to break down? What happens a couple of years after that when that well is just not functioning and the Africans have to fix it and that company is long gone? So we've looked at all these different areas and it started to develop that much more. And that's one of the things that we'll be doing here through these podcasts and through our website, which is www.pathinator, PATHINATOR.com. So what helps, what hurts? How do we travel? A little background on travel. But with this idea of travel and helping, the way they're connected, I did connect the two throughout the podcast here. I talked about how I developed from just looking for a good time to how could I help when I was out on the road. But it's not just helping others, it's also self-help. And as I said, I developed quite a bit. I was young and very green, and I started to learn a lot about people, a lot about myself, a lot about my strengths and weaknesses as I traveled. That then is the intent of this podcast. We will look at travel. We'll look at different places. We'll look at different trips. We'll look at how to help. We'll look at different issues. What is helping? What is hurting? We'll look at how you can help yourself. So thanks for joining us. Hope you enjoyed this podcast and that you'll join us again for the next one.